Welcome to the Habits and Hustle podcast, a podcast that uncovers the rituals, unspoken habits, and mindsets of extraordinary people. A podcast powered by Habit Nest. Now here's your host, Jennifer Cohen.
I have to tell you, I'm a huge fan of yours. So,
oh, thank you.
I love all of your books, and that's why, I was putting together all these questions, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's no way that I can fit all of this stuff into one podcast, because between the Happiness Project, your Four Tendencies, Better Than Before. I mean, each one of those deserves its own big time frame.
Oh, you're so nice.
No,
Thank you.
It's absolutely true. So that's why it's like a big, and also the other book, about the clutter, because it's like now basically I'm living that person right now, because everything is a whole large mess of questions from a little bit from here, a little bit there. So, needless to say, I'm very happy to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. So, thank you for coming over here. And do you consider yourself, you basically are a human nature, habits, happiness expert, right? Who basically was a lawyer. You went to Yale, and then you pursued your passion to become a writer, and things obviously worked out very well for you.
Yeah, they did. No, it was a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun.
So I guess my first question is, what is the importance of habits for happiness overall?
Well, habits are the invisible architecture of everyday life. And if we have habits that work for us, we're a lot more likely to be happier, healthier, more productive, and more creative. And research shows that at least 40%, maybe more, of everyday life is made up of habits. And so they play a big role. Now, I will say that one of the things that I learned in writing my book, Better Than Before, is that while I love habits and welcome habits, and I'm always trying to make other new things into habits because I find them so freeing, some people don't like habits, and that's fine too. Some people really do prefer to be more spontaneous and not have things locked in the same way and kind of do what they want to do. And they need to find their own way to create those good behaviors. But habits can really free us from having to use self-control or use willpower and decision fatigue. So they really are a very useful tool if you're trying to make your life happier.
I mean, I think so. I mean, given the name of the podcast, Habits and Hustle, right? I feel that sometimes the more things you put on autopilot, it eliminates that, it gives you that extra time to focus on things that are more meaningful or can kind of progress your life a little bit further, right?
Well, I 100% agree. But, I did my Four Tendencies personality framework where I divided people into four tendencies. And what I found is one of the tendencies, the rebel tendency, they often don't have as the positive association with habits. They don't think of them as being freeing in the same way. And so I used to be much more confident in saying habits are great. And I'm now I'm much more habits are great if you like habits. But even if you don't like habits, you can still find a way to exercise. You can still find a way to write a novel in your free time. You may think about it, you may set it up in a slightly different way. Habits are not a universal tool, but they're a very, very powerful and common tool.
I think I want to get into the Four Tendencies, because I think it's actually very interesting, because I do feel, because you put it's four archetypes, right? And yeah. I think with me, it said when I took your quiz, and then everyone should take this quiz, it said I was an obliger type, but I never saw myself as that. I felt like I was more like a rebel type, and there are ways you morph them together. But just to say, and I want to talk to you about that, but what you were saying about habits and how sometimes people, and like you said, maybe a rebel in the Four Tendencies wouldn't feel that habits are a way to kind of make their life happier. And I had a guy on my podcast yesterday, actually, who's extremely successful. His name is Jesse Itzler. And he was actually talking about how habits for him could get you into a rut, and how you don't really sometimes are able to change because you become so fixated in what you do day to day in a routine. So it's interesting. I'm with you. I used to feel like you had to have a very structured day to have success. But I mean, you talk this in almost all of your books, that it's about knowing who you are and knowing yourself, right?
Yes. Right.
And
exactly.
it's very important, because if you're not that type of personality, it could be very hindering, right?
Yeah. Right. I think the problem comes is when we think, well, there's a right way, there's a best way. If I can't do it that way, there must be something wrong with me. I don't have any self-control. I have no willpower. I'm not a real grown-up. I don't have any self-esteem. I can't take time for myself. What does this mean? Or, so I kind of blame myself. Or just the opposite. I say, well, what's wrong with you? If I can do it and you can't, well, you lack self-control. You lack willpower. You can't keep your promises to yourself. You need to change. And what I found is there's a lot of ways to achieve our aims. And we all might want to achieve a goal like exercising or being productive creatively or something. There's a lot of ways to get there. And so it's more useful to think about well, what works for me? What appeals to me? When do I succeed? And if I'm not succeeding, what are some other things I could try? Rather than saying, I need to jam myself into someone else's mold, because if it works for them, then obviously it should work for me. It's just like getting up early. Research shows there are some people are morning people and some people are night people. It's largely genetically determined and a function of age. And so the idea that somebody would say confidently, if something's important to you, you should get up and do it first thing, before work every day. It's well, that's great advice for me because I'm a morning person.
Right.
And I absolutely follow that advice. But that's not good advice for everybody, because night people are at their most productive and creative and energetic later in the day. And if they try to do it first thing in the day, they're setting themselves up for failure. It's not that it's bad advice. It's just that it's not good advice for everyone. And so you have to say to yourself, not does this make sense on paper? Because on paper, it makes total sense, right?
Right.
Say to yourself, am I the kind of person who succeeds if I try to do something important or intellectually taxing or physically taxing early in the morning? If you're heck no, I can barely get to work on time and I really don't wake up until 10:30, then okay, no, going for a 3-mile run first thing in the morning is not going to work for you. So I think exactly as you say, it's really a question of saying what's true for me and how do I bring circumstances into line with what works for me, rather than trying to come up with the best way or the right way or the most efficient way. Because you just can't really generalize.
But you know what? I do find that when people have a structure, and I guess because I'm that person, right? So of course I'm going to resonate with this kind of belief system, is that it does, when I exercise every day, it does eliminate that am I, oh my God, when am I going to exercise? How am I going to exercise? Yep. All that neuroses that go on. And also I'm Jewish, maybe that's another part of it. Or it also does there are things that research proves that when you do exercise first thing in the morning and when you eat the same breakfast, when you do these certain things, it does give you more focus. There are benefits to
if you do it
right.
But it's what's better, the exercise you do or the perfect exercise you never do because you can't get up that early?
Absolutely.
I mean, and the thing is, the name of your podcast is Habits and Hustle. So clearly that's where you're coming from and that's where your audience is coming from. So maybe you don't really need to think about the people for whom habits are not enticing because they're not interested in this. And so you can really say, for people who are deeply interested in habits, like you and me and so many other people, let's take advantage of them because they're so freeing and they give us so much power and relieve us from so much stress and mental fatigue. But that's very different from saying well, they're universally good. And everybody would be better off if they did it. Because the thing is, a rebel, I've spoken to so many rebels and they do better when they're I exercise when I feel like it. And I know a bunch of classes and I keep my yoga mat and my running shoes in my car. And some days I feel like going inside and some days I feel like skipping. And some days I feel like doing a really hard cardio workout. I'm that wouldn't work for me. I need to have a plan. I need to have a schedule. But okay, we can do it differently. That's fine. We can both get regular exercise, but we don't have to convince each other to try it a different way. Because I think a lot of times people do waste a lot of energy just sort of talking about making an intellectual argument about what's best.
Yeah.
What's best is what works for a particular person. It doesn't really matter what's best for 87.6% of the population, right? Because if you're the other part, you want to know what's going to work for you. I mean, and that's what cracks me up with the habit research. Whenever you read it, they're always and then there's a small group of people who don't really seem to form habits. And I'm yeah, well, what do you do about those people? Because they need to take blood pressure medication too. You can't just hand wave them. What's going on with those folks? So anyway, with the Four Tendencies, I tried to count for everybody because I saw these, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, these very distinct patterns in how people come to the idea of habits, let alone how to form them. And so that's what led me to the Four Tendencies, because I thought, well, everybody would feel the way I do, obviously.
Right.
You feel the way I do. We agree. Not everybody does.
That's 100% true. And also another point that you made was because of the podcast being called what it is, obviously the people listening, maybe not everybody, but are kind of are already interested and curious about habits and hustle, right? So that becomes like my lane.
And that's great because that's a big lane for most people. I think habits do, because in my framework, upholders, questioners, and obligers all tend to take advantage of habits, and even rebels sometimes take care of habits. So it's a very enticing. There's a big promise there, but it's not everyone, which is fine because nothing's for everyone. When it comes to
habits or how to get there.
I mean, like here's an example. So with habits, healthy habits. One of the strategies, so in Better Than Before, I have 21 strategies that we can use to make or break our habits. And some work for some people and not for others. And some are available to us at some times, but not at other times. So one of the strategies that works really well for some people and not at all for others, so I'd be very curious to know which side of this you're on, is when you're facing a strong temptation, not a weak temptation, but a strong temptation. So for instance, I have an incredible sweet tooth. And I'm an abstainer. I use the strategy of abstaining. And that is, with somebody like me, it's easier to have none than it is to have a little bit. So I can have I can have no Thin Mint cookies, or I can have like a sleeve of Thin Mint cookies. I can't have one Thin Mint cookie. I can't have half a dish of ice cream. But then there are people who are moderators, and moderators do better when they have something sometimes, or they have a little bit, and they follow the 80-20 rule. And these are the people who are like, I just keep a bar of fine chocolate in my desk drawer, and every day or two, I have one little square, and that's all I need. Why don't you do the same thing? And I say, because I can't. It's easy for me to have none, but I can't have a little. It's too hard for me to have a little. And again, people will say, you are doing it wrong. So moderators tell an abstainer like me, you shouldn't demonize certain food. You shouldn't be so rigid. You should learn how to just like have a cookie now and then. And I say to moderators, why do you keep breaking your promises to yourself? Why don't you just go cold turkey? You're always finding these loopholes. Why don't you just like be done with it? And they're like, I don't want to. And so and often I think people will say, well, I should be a moderator, or I should be an abstainer. When in fact, it's like, some people are abstainers and some people are moderators. If one way isn't working for you, maybe try the other way. I think a lot of people think that abstaining sounds really hard, but actually, if you're really an abstainer in your heart, it's much easier to abstain than it is. I can't be moderate. It's too hard, but I can abstain. Like I eat a crazy low carb diet. I abstain from so much. It doesn't take anything. To your point about like the decision fatigue and kind of the friction that comes. Yeah, it's so easy. Like, oh, I don't eat that stuff. So there's no temptation.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's funny because I know the popular answer, and being in the health and fitness space like I am, people always ask you that. And you're like, oh yeah, it's the 80-20 rule. You know what I mean? Just eat it a little bit so you don't deprive yourself. But to me, that's such a platitude, it's like, doesn't work. I mean, if people say it because it sounds good, but
it works for some people though. For some people, it's really important. It's really good. And I think dietitians and nutritionists tend to be moderators. So that's why they're convinced it works, because it works for them.
But it doesn't work for me. I'm like you.
So you're an abstainer.
I'm an abstainer. Absolutely. Because I can't go to a buffet because I know as much as right?
Yes. Always order off the menu. Never order from the buffet.
That's my number one rule. Always order off the menu, because I know myself, to your point, that I cannot just take a little bit. That's just not my personality type. And I set myself up for failure every time. I think this time I can do it. And so I think that's a really good point. So first of all, the fact that like you put kind of not just clarity, but you put that out there like that, I think is very important, because then people end up feeling really bad about themselves when they're not fitting into what the general population or what they think that they should be fitting into. So let's talk about two things. Let's first go over in your Four Tendencies, the 4 different types of people or personality types that people can fall into. And then we can go more into habits after that.
Yeah, because it tells you a lot about how to set yourself up for habits. So this is my framework called the Four Tendencies, and it divides people into 4 categories: upholders, questioners, obligers, and rebels, which we were talking about. And I'm going to briefly describe it, and most people know what they are, and a lot of people, and the characters on Game of Thrones, and they're not hard to spot once you know them. But there is a quiz online. It's at quiz.gretchenrubin.com if people want to take like a quick free quiz. I think 2.8 million people have taken this free quiz now, so it's very easy. So what the Four Tendencies looks at is how you respond to expectations. And we all face 2 kinds of expectations. outer expectations, which is like a work deadline or a request from a friend. And then there are inner expectations, like my own desire to keep a New Year's resolution, my own desire to get back into meditation. So depending on how we respond to outer and inner expectations, that's what makes us an upholder, a questioner, an obliger, or a rebel. And you can see why this is really important with habits, because habits are either an outer expectation or an inner expectation. So upholders readily meet outer and inner expectations. They meet a work deadline. They keep a New Year's resolution without much fuss. They want to know what others expect from them, but their expectations for themselves are just as important. So their motto is, discipline is my freedom. Then there are questioners. Questioners question all expectations. They'll do something if they think it makes sense. So they resist anything arbitrary, ineffective, unjustified. They always want the research. They always want the data. They always want to know why. And if something meets their inner standard, if they think, okay, this makes sense, they will do it no problem. If it fails their inner standard, they will push back. So their motto is, I'll comply if you convince me why. Then there are obligers. Obligers readily meet outer expectations, but they struggle to meet inner expectations. And I got my first insight into this tendency when a friend said, I don't understand it. I know I'm happier when I exercise. And when I was in high school, I was on the track team and I never missed track practice. So why can't I go running now? Well, when she had a team and a coach expecting her to show up, she showed up no problem. But when she's trying to go on her own, she struggles. And the key thing for obligers to remember is that if they want to meet an inner expectation, they must create some form of outer accountability. If you want to read more, join a book group. If you want to exercise more, take a class where they charge you. Work out with a friend who's going to be annoyed if you don't show up. Take your dog for a run who's going to tear up the living room furniture if he doesn't get his exercise. Raise money for a charity. Think of your duty to your future self. There's a million ways to create outer accountability, and obligers must have it. So their motto is, you can count on me, and I'm counting on you to count on me. And then finally, rebels, which we were talking about before. Rebels resist all expectations, outer and inner alike. They want to do what they want to do in their own way, in their own time. They can do anything they choose to do, anything they want to do. But if you ask or tell them to do something, they're very likely to resist. And typically, they don't like to tell themselves what to do. Like, they won't say, well, I'm going to sign up for a 10 a.m. spin class on Saturday, because they think, I don't know what I'm going to want to do on Saturday. And just the idea that somebody's expecting me to show up bugs me. So their motto is, you can't make me, and neither can I.
Right.
And the thing is, your tendency, the obliger tendency, that is the biggest tendency for both men and women. You either are an obliger, you have many obligers in your life, big tendency. The smallest tendency is rebel. So it's conspicuous tendency, but that is the smallest tendency.
What's the percentage of obligers of the population?
It's like, I know it's 41% or something.
Wow, 41%. And then you can have these, you can also like be combinations, right? Because like I said, I feel like some of it, I agreed with the rebel, like, I don't like authority, really. I don't like when people tell me what to do. But yet, if I do have an expectation, or someone has an expectation of me, I will always do it. So when is it actually? How often are there a lot of like hybrids? Do people have hybrids?
I think that people are really solidly within a tendency.
Okay.
They really are in one tendency. But as you point out, each of the tendencies overlaps with two tendencies because it has something in common. So like, let's say you're an obliger, okay, so obligers also have an affinity with upholders because they both readily meet outer expectations. So they have that in common. But obligers also are like rebels in that they don't meet inner expectations. And so in that sense, they have a deep affinity with rebels. So some obligers tip more to upholders. So like I have a podcast, Happier with Gretchen Rubin, and my co-host is my sister, and she's an obliger who tips to upholder. But you may be an obliger who tips to rebel. And that means the kind of the rebel side of you is it kind of flavors your obligerness. You're an obliger, but you kind of are like a little bit more on that rebel end of things. And this is true with all four. So like I'm an upholder who tips to questioner, but I know I have a good friend who's an upholder who tips to obliger. And so it gives a different flavor to the tendencies, but I think people really are solidly within the tendencies.
Within one of the tendencies, yeah. I mean, and when you think about it, I think about what my husband would be and what my friends would be. Like, I think that's very true, right? Because we have one dominant portion. So then, of those four, so like, then if I were to say, like, when you're trying to form a habit, right? What do you need to have? Because So like an obliger who, like you were saying, needs that accountability, like myself. What is what's the easiest way or the best way to actually form a habit in these tendencies or that tendency?
Well, so there's the 21 strategies of habit change, which some are kind of universal and some are better for different tendencies than the other. But if you're going to talk about the tendencies, absolutely, for obliger, if they're trying to form habits, what they really need is outer accountability. And so a couple things to keep in mind if you're an obliger who's trying to form accountability, because I imagine a lot of your listeners are in that situation, because I can imagine that they would be drawn to your subject. So you want to think about outer accountability, but you also want to recognize that obligers vary dramatically in what kind of accountability works for them. And so something that is an accountability measure just may not work for you, in which case you need to try something else. So for instance, some obligers can feel obligated to their future selves. Gretchen right now doesn't want to do this, but future Gretchen will be just so disappointed. I have to do it for future Gretchen. Or maybe my duty to be a role model for someone else would work for me. Or maybe I pay for a class. But then I talked to an obliger who's like, oh, I signed up for a class with a trainer, but then I realized, if I don't go, he still gets paid and he gets the time back. So she wasn't going to help him out. I was like, this is not working for you as an accountability measure. Another thing that I would say for obligers is that typically sweethearts and spouses do not make good accountability partners for a very sweet reason. Your sweetheart is as close to you. You're as close to me as I am to me, and I would ignore me, and I'm going to ignore you. And so often people will be very upset with an obliger. They might, like a woman said to me, for years I've been telling my husband he had to get his weight under control, he had to start exercising, he had to go to the doctor, and he just ignored me. One day his boss is like, hey, Bob, you got to get in shape. I want you to go to the doctor and drop 30 pounds. And like the next day he started, and she's like, he doesn't care what I think. And I'm like, no, you're an inner expectation. The boss is an outer expectation. So he's hearing what the boss says. It has nothing to do with his love for you. It's just that in a way, his love for you is meaning that message isn't getting across. Some people can be accountable to their children. I've heard of, it's important also for obligers to remember they often need to be accountable for things they want to do. Just the idea that you want to get a massage or you love to do yoga, if you're not doing it, you probably need outer accountability. And I heard of this hilarious, brilliant idea of these two sisters-in-law. They both wanted to get back into yoga and they both love massage. So the way they set it up is if I do 30 days of yoga, you get a massage. If you do 30 days of yoga, I get a massage. So I have to do the yoga so you get your massage, because I'm not going to let my sister-in-law down. I would let myself down. But I get the yoga and you get the massage. Win, 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 win. So there's all these clever ways to set up outer accountability once you realize that that's what's necessary. Unfortunately, obligers often say things like, I need to put myself first. I need to draw boundaries. I need to take more time for self-care. I need to get motivated. I need to keep my promises to myself. No, you need outer accountability. That's the quick and easy solution. It works. All the other stuff, it's not really relevant. It's searching for an explanation for this pattern, which is, why do I keep my promises to other people, but I don't keep my promises to myself? The solution for that is outer accountability. Then obligers can achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve.
What I like about this is it's very simple, right? Like anybody, whoever you need to work with. I think especially when it comes to like work, obviously for professional and personal relationships, because we tend to deal with people based on what we would do, like we were talking about early, right?
Yes.
Right. And you don't get very far that way, right?
But like that, it's so hard not to do that. It just comes so naturally. Hard. It's very hard. And that's why I think sometimes like a vocabulary can help, because it kind of can draw an outline around behavior that otherwise you don't really see distinctly, and so you don't understand how people are different. Yeah, because you're like, I don't even understand what's going on here. But then once there's a word for it, you're like, oh, I get it. You're this, I'm that. You're an abundance lover. I'm a simplicity lover. That's why my desk is clean and your desk is full of piles, and and you like it that way. It's like, okay.
Well, yeah. Well, you simplify it for people. It's like that. Remember that book, The 5 Love Languages?
Oh, I love The 5 Love Languages.
Right? Yes. And it makes it like, it kind of like simplifies things, right? So for people to kind of understand what box that other person fits in to kind of communicate better. And it actually does make a difference, right? Because people think and our brains are not all computed the same way.
Well, and what I like about, obviously I'm biased towards the Four Tendencies since I created it. But what I like about it is it kind of it tells you what to try, what to do next. I feel like a lot of personality frameworks are like, you're creative and innovative. And I'm like, okay, so what? Like, the thing about the Four Tendencies is it's like, if you're a questioner, you need to look for the data, you need to look for the research, you have to find an authority you really trust and believe in. And if you're having trouble sticking to a diet, it's probably because really in your heart of hearts, you haven't decided what you think is the most efficient, the most justified, the best possible research, science-based data. If you get clear in your head what that is, your action will follow. That's what I would say to a questioner. But to an obliger, I'd be like, where's your accountability? Like, are you going to use this app? Are you going to use a nutritionist? Like, are you going to use a health coach? Are you going to make a deal with your sister-in-law? What are you going to do? Rebel, I'd be like, it's your identity. This is who you are. You love to cook fresh food. You love to go to farmers markets. You love fresh vegetables. You love interesting cuisine, and you're free. You're not trapped. You're not addicted to sugar and ultra processed foods. They don't control you with their fancy packages and their expensive campaigns, because you make your own choices, because you're free and you know what's right for you and your body. And people are like, yes, that's right. That is who I am. That's what works for a rebel. Upholder, it's like, I think I'm going to quit sugar. And I just like the next day, I'm like, okay, that's over. Done.
You know, what I love, I also think this would be a great tool for people who in the sales business, like people who do sales, right? Because you could read your person so much quicker. Because again, that way you're not wasting a lot of like time and minutes and dealing with your own, like, well, this is how I would do it, and this is how I would do it. Like, because you can usually read somebody based on that and then tailor your sales approach, really. So it's a great business tool in a way.
Well, because one of the ways this comes up is questioners feel like the more kind of arguments and data they provide, the more they will persuade people. But often people who aren't questioners get very overwhelmed and kind of annoyed by that. And so if you're a questioner and you feel yourself being like, here's this, you're like, okay, maybe I need to back off, because that person might not be working, and it might actually be irritating them. Whereas if you're talking to a questioner, you're like, oh, I'm going to just like, here's the consumer, report, and here's this, and here, and give them all that research. Yeah, right. Exactly right. Yeah.
You know what I think is great about your books and what you do? Everything dovetails nicely together, right? It does. Like, it's at the end of the day, it's all about like an overarching idea of being happy and being successful and happy, and like, this is knowing your personality, how what's important. Like, basically, like I was watching something on like success rules that you did. I don't know if it was an Oprah thing I watched or some other thing I was doing. And I found that to be, it's very, a lot of it's kind of common sense, but as my mom would say, common sense isn't very common, right?
Oh, so, that's a great line. I have not heard that. Yes.
And it's
true. Yes.
Right? Like, one of the first points was, again, like, to know yourself, right? Like, duh, because we're not all the same, but people need to be told these things. And the other one that you would say is do what you love, right? And then you gave this, then you kind of followed it up with, because people say, okay, do what I love. Okay, I love taking my dog for a walk. But what you did was you said, a great way to know what you love is to look at who you envy in the world.
Yes.
That was so smart, because that's so true, right? Because I think we all aspire, we all have something, and envy is a very human nature quality, right? Like, we all have it. So if people who say they don't have it, they're lying, right? But can you talk a little bit more about that? Because it's your experience with what happened with you, and well, I'll let you continue.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, envy it's sort of it's an unpleasant and kind of dark emotion, and we don't like to feel it. We don't like to acknowledge it. We often don't like to admit to it. As you say, it's sort of like, it's very unattractive, right. But it's a very helpful emotion. And it's really important to remember that in happiness, negative emotions are really, really important, because they're like big flashing signals that something isn't right. So when you feel that unpleasant feeling of envy, it's full of information. Because as you say, when we envy someone, it means they have something that we wish we had for ourselves. Because people can have things where I'm like, oh, that's great for you, but I don't, it's great you're going on a 6-month trip to Japan, but I don't want to go on a 6-month trip so I don't envy that. Right. One of the ways I saw this in my own life was when I was a lawyer. I was clerking for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court. So I had this great law job. And I was reading my alumni magazine, where they kind of update you on everything that people in your class have been doing. And I noticed that when I read about people who had interesting legal jobs, I felt a kind of mild interest. And when I read about people who had interesting writing jobs, I felt sick with envy. Now, why did I feel that way? I wasn't on a writing path at all, but I noticed that it was like almost to the point of like not wanting to see it or feeling so uncomfortable I wanted to turn away. And that told me a lot about what I wanted for myself, because I didn't really want those interesting legal jobs.
Right.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, you can have it.
Right.
But the writing jobs, those to me really attracted me. So thinking about whom you envy, and it can be really useful. And sometimes also we disguise envy with like anger or resentment or criticism. So like somebody in your office, like, oh my gosh, she's going off on another trip. Like, I don't know why she's traveling all the time. I mean, who's got the time and the energy for that? Really what you're saying is, gosh, I wish I were going on all those really excellent trips. And then you can say to yourself, maybe I need to plan a trip. Maybe I need to take the time and the energy and plan a trip, because even if it's just like, like a drive to another state, because maybe the emotion that I'm feeling against this other person is really telling me about something that I haven't acknowledged to myself yet.
And do you think that's I think when I was looking at that, or one of your books, because they all blend together, because I've read them all. I don't know which one came from which one.
No, I have the same problem.
I'm like, I was from this one, that one, was the Happiness Project, or that one. That kind of like, again, dovetails into act the way you want to feel, right? Because sometimes we don't act, we act or we do things not the way we actually, or we cover it, like that trip, right? We're really kind of envious and we wish it was us, right? But we pretend we're angry about it,
Yeah.
So that was a really good point too for happiness.
Yeah, well, this is a really fascinating psychological phenomenon. We can really kind of manipulate ourselves to a very uncanny degree by using it. So yeah, the idea is that you act the way you wish you felt, because we think that we act because of the way we feel. So I feel like, okay, because I'm angry, that must be why I'm throwing things and yelling. But actually in the brain, it's more like, oh, there's all this yelling and throwing stuff around happening. We must be feeling really angry. Like let's like bump up the emotion. And so we can take control of this by acting the way that we wish we felt. So like if you feel sluggish, act energetic, like move more quickly, speak with more energy, and you'll make yourself feel more energetic. Or if you're feeling really kind of shy and reserved, act friendly, like really pump it up and try to act. Because the thing is, it's very hard for us to consciously change our mental state, but it's very easy for us to consciously change our actions in the world. And so, if you are feeling resentful to someone, maybe try to voice your gratitude for that person. And kind of by putting yourself through that motion, or if you're feeling angry, you might act in an affectionate way, and that's going to help you feel affectionate. So sometimes people wait to feel loving to give a kiss, but it's actually that giving a kiss is going to make you feel loving. And this is something that it's a very easy way to intervene in our mental state by just like controlling what we do with our bodies.
Now, how long do you think it takes to actually change that? Because
right away.
You think so? Like,
yeah.
So if I think you said this in that one of your, I think you started giving your husband a kiss every morning, and therefore, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And that eventually becomes your new normal, or becomes second nature, right? Do you feel that everyone though generally has a baseline to happiness, and you can only move it so much, or what do you?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of research into that. And some people have argued that there's like a set point and people kind of drift up or drift down, but they always come back to a set point. And I think it's more helpful to think about a set range, because research suggests that about 50% of happiness is genetically determined. And then 10 to 20% is something called life circumstances. So that's things like age, wealth, health, marital status, occupation, education, things like that. Then the rest is very much influenced by our conscious thoughts and actions. And so I think, one person's range might be like 4 to 7, and somebody else's range might be 7 to 10. And some people are born Tiggers and some people are Eeyores, and we see that in the world. But so I think the question for all of us is, given what is within my conscious control, can I make sure that I'm at the top of my range instead of at the bottom of my range? So maybe my top is a 7 and your top is a 10. But I still want to be at a 7. And that's what I can control. Now, can you change somebody? And I talk to many people who are kind of like naturally very ebullient types who have children who are like lower on the kind of happiness, natural range. And they kind of want to change their children. And they're like, how do I just tell this kid to look on the right side and smile? And like, I'm like, yeah, you get what you get and you don't get upset. Some people are just, they're wired differently. And so you kind of have to accept, a person's nature, But I do think that, I mean, I certainly found for myself, and I think it's true for just about everyone, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in our ordinary lives without taking a lot of time, energy, or money, where we really can move the needle and we really can help ourselves to become happier. So, and that's what I always talk about, is like being happier, because achieving happiness, it's like, what is that? It's like, I can't even hold that idea in my mind. It's like, what does that even mean? But happier, it's like, if you did this, would you be happier? It's like, usually that's clear. Yeah, I'd be happier. If I exercised almost every day, yeah, I think I'd be happier. That's easy. When I achieve happiness, I mean, what does that even mean? I don't know.
Well, I think that's true. I think also, like anything else that you want to be better at, you got to practice, right?
Yes.
Right? So it's a skill. Yes. Like if you want to be a good basketball player, you're going to play basketball. And so these are just like ways and tools for people to work on, right? To get their level a little bit up or a couple notches up. Where were you, by the way, before you did all of this stuff? Do you know what your happiness level was, your baseline, and where are you now?
I was a 7.
You were a 7?
Yeah, I was a 7. And, and that's the thing. Okay. When they look at people all around the world in all kinds of circumstances, most people say they're either pretty happy or very happy. Most people are pretty happy. People are resilient. People are pretty happy. Yeah. And I would say, did my happiness project and all my happiness research change kind of my inborn nature? No. But what it did is it changed my experience of my life, because I have so much more like fun and friends and excitement and enthusiasm. And I have a lot less guilt and boredom and anger because I behave myself better. And, I've just thought a lot more about my values and putting my values into the world. I've thought about the importance of growth and novelty. Like, I just know how to set myself up. Am I still the same person deep down? 100%. Like if I'm on the subway, like staring into space, I'm the same person I was, when I was 7, but my experience of my life is a lot happier.
So after you finished the happiness project, did you continue with lots of these things? And you did?
More and more and more and more. Yes. More and more and more and more and more. Yeah. All the time. Yeah. I love it. I'm an upholder. So for me, it's like, what could be more fun than a new habit? But I recognize now that not everybody feels that way.
No, exactly. And then hold on a second, because you said, I was going to say this earlier, and then we talked about the 4 tendencies, but where was it? I had like a little note to myself that I wanted to ask you. Oh, yes. Because you talked about how to form a habit, and you said something, again, one of these books, I don't remember, about clarity. It's very important that when you want to form a habit, that you have to have, there's different types of clarity. And I thought that I really liked that. And that's why I wrote it down to ask you, because before you actually do this, you need to have like a precursor to it. And
so there's 21 strategies, as I said, to habit change. And this is one of them, because some of the strategies are really obvious, like scheduling. It's like, okay, we all get it. Monitoring. Okay, we all do it. Clarity is a little bit harder to see. And clarity is just the idea that we want to be really clear about what we're asking of ourselves and why. Because if I say to myself something like, I really just want to appreciate every day more. It's like, what is that? Like, what does that even look like? What does that mean? What am I aiming for? What do I mean by that? And so the more that we're like, I want to eat healthfully. What does that mean? So I think it's like clarity is like, I am going to prepare a lunch and bring it into work every day instead of ordering from a takeout place. Or I am going to have 3 meals a day because I know that if I get too hungry, that's when I head to the vending machine. I'm going to have almonds for a snack instead of popcorn, or whatever it would be for you. Different people would have different rules. But the idea is clarity, because the more you have identified what you're asking for yourself and why, because also sometimes people get into the situation where they're just hand waving. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to 100%, I'm going to start. I totally need to start exercising. No, they're not really. They're just saying that because they want you to get off their back. They don't want to argue about it. So they just say they will. They have no intention of doing it. Clarity is like, okay, you say you're going to exercise. When are you going to exercise? What's that going to look like? Do you have the right clothes? Do you need to join a gym? Like, are you going to do this on YouTube? Are you going to sweat so you have to take a shower after? Or maybe you don't sweat so you don't need to take a shower. Like, what does this look like? Clarity means that you can't kind of make excuses to yourself because it's just sort of this nice, vague concept. Clarity kind of forces action because it starts you down a road of like actual behavior change.
You know what I find interesting? That you wrote the Four Tendencies after you wrote Better Than Before and Happiness Project, because I feel like that's like the crux, knowing the personality.
No, you're exactly right. You're 100% right.
Right?
But the problem is I didn't invent it. I mean, the reason that I understood it was because I was seeing all of these weird patterns in habit formation. Like my friend on the track team, like, what is up with that? Or people would say to me, oh, I would say, because a habit question that I would often ask people to try to get to their thinking is I'd say, how do you feel about New Year's resolutions? Yeah. And a good group of people would always say exactly the same thing. They would say, I would keep a resolution when it made sense to me. I would not wait for January 1st because January 1st is an arbitrary date. And I was like, that never gave me a pause. Why is it that they're all saying exactly the same thing? Arbitrary, right? That was what was tripping them up. And so it was only when I was deep into the habit research and understanding like, well, and also, okay, so with obligers, here's something that puzzled me, like, especially if you know the big five personality. So one of the things that they look at is conscientiousness. This had always puzzled me because I'm highly conscientious. So I take those tests, I'm highly conscientious, and I know that about myself. And I get people who are not conscientious. Okay, fine. Some people don't want to be conscientious. What puzzled me was the people who were patchy. Sometimes they were 100% conscientious, and then other times they were 0% conscientious. To me, this didn't make sense. Why was it that sometimes a person would be, they clearly had the discipline, they clearly had the ability, they did it under certain circumstances, but then in other circumstances, they just seemed helpless to follow through. How do you explain that pattern? And that's what then obliger. It was like, that makes perfect sense because it's the outer accountability that is the difference in those circumstances. So you're exactly right. I really wish I'd written the Four Tendencies first because it was set up Better Than Before, so much better. But I was like deep into Better Than Before. And then I was like, okay, I got to write this book first before I can get to the Four Tendencies because like, this book's half written.
Well, yeah, because because like I said, all your books actually dovetail, but really like at the end of the day, it's about first knowing who you are, knowing your personality, and then everything else kind of like falls more into place, you know? I mean, that's why like I was going to say to you, like I was going to ask you a while ago, like what's the first step of becoming better than before? But really, I can kind of figure it out. It's basically knowing your personality first.
Yeah, self-knowledge.
Self-knowledge. Right?
Absolutely. Because otherwise it's like, if you're a morning person or a night person, that's really going to help you. If you're an abstainer or moderator, that's really going to help you. Here's one about work pace. Some people are marathoners, some people are sprinters. So marathoners are people who like to start early. They don't like a deadline. They like to work slowly and steadily. They feel like that's when they do their best work and their most creative work. Sprinters are people, they like the kind of the intensity and the adrenaline of the deadline. They do their best work like right up against it. They like to work very intensely. If they start early, they kind of lose interest and waste time. They're not procrastinating because that's how they do their best work. They look back on their work with pride. They don't feel like they needed more time, but they want to do it all at the end. And again, it's like a lot of times people will say, well, you're doing it wrong because you shouldn't do that. And it's like, well, it works for you and you're doing your best work. Like, unless it bothers me. I mean, maybe if we have to work together, that's a problem. But that's very different from me just saying to my 18-year-old, you shouldn't write your paper in the last week. You should take 3 weeks. It's like, maybe not, because maybe this person's a sprinter. Again, it's like set yourself up for success.
Well, and all like exactly. And then but then there are other things like isn't your last book is called Out of Order, Inner Calm, which is about like cluttering, which people, again, like it's funny because I'm surprised no one ever talked more about this, just because it's something that you would think that the less clutter someone has on like how things appear on the outside is how it directly affects your inside, right? Yeah. But yet, like it came way after all of this stuff, right? Because to get peace, I feel, and get order and feel calmness. But maybe now as I think about it more, depending on the kind of person, it's all back to the personality types, right? You may not care about that stuff.
Well, the desire for outer order isn't particularly correlated with the tendencies, but I do think people are very different. Like my sister, Elizabeth, is clutter blind. And there are a small number of people who are clutter blind. They really just don't see it. They don't care. Like, I mean, I love to go over to my sister's house. She lives in Los Angeles. And whenever I can, I go over there and I clear her clutter because I just enjoy it and she lets me do it. I just begged her to let me FaceTime with her this weekend and let me help her clean up her home office. But, I mean, in between, like if all things being equal, yeah, she likes it to be orderly. Does she actually care? No. And for years, I couldn't believe it when she said, I just don't care. Because I'm like, how can you not care? She just doesn't care. And other people just don't care. And so you could say, well, you would be happier. You'd be more effective. You'd be more productive. It would be better. It's like, or not. They don't care. And it's a small group of people, but you can't say you should dedicate a lot of time and energy to this. You should make your bed every day because it's going to make you happier. Not necessarily. So it's like, if it works for you, it's a useful tool. There's no magic to making your bed.
No, but I guess what I was kind of more getting at was that all of the, like I said, everything kind of like works towards a common goal of happiness.
Yes.
And I 100%. Think and I always do feel like when people have clutter, it does represent something that's going on internally in their life. And, you know, if you do feel cleaner and more like calm and serene, if you do get that stuff out of the way. So that's why, again, like I feel like every time you
break. Yeah, what I'm saying is you feel that way. It's not that one feels that way. One can feel many different ways. You feel that way. I feel that way. Many people feel that way. Yes.
That's my point.
I totally agree. But it isn't the universal truth of human nature.
I know.
It bugs me. Like, I can't go into my sister's house, so that's starting to clear off her like kitchen counter. But
I mean, that's how I would feel too. Are there certain jobs that people do better at when there are, now getting back to like I said, we're going back and forth in the Four Tendencies. Are there certain jobs and people that questioners do better at or rebels do better at? Like, is like in all of your research, did you find that these two careers are usually this kind of personality type or that kind of personality type?
Well, what I found is that just about any kind of career can be done by any of the tendencies, and they would bring their own strengths and limitations to it. So you could imagine something like a journalist. You could be like, oh, questioner, right? But an obliger could be a great journalist. A rebel could be a great journalist. An upholder could be a great journalist. They might bring a different set of skills to it and a great, different set of limitations. I will say that there are circumstances that suit them better. So if you're a questioner, you do not want to be in an environment where there's like strong corporate spirit and we have a visionary leader and we're all here to execute on that vision, or we work as a team, because it's like, okay, but the fact that like we've always done it this way or that's what the team thinks isn't good enough for me. So I want to get myself to a place where they really value my questioning nature, because if I might be seen as not being a team player and that could count against me, whereas in another environment that could really benefit me. Now, rebels, I will say that rebels often do well in something like sales, where there tends to be kind of an atmosphere of like, look, whatever you got to do to make a sale, that's okay. Because whereas an upholder is like, well, it's 5 minutes after the deadline. What are we going to do? Like, that's the rule. But a rebel's like, oh, come on. I can make a deal. That could really suit them. Also, they tend to do well in things where there's a lot of variety, a lot of autonomy. So like I talked to a rebel who was like the manager of a restaurant chain. So every day she was driving to a different restaurant, talking to different people. She was on the road a lot of the time, so nobody really knew where she was. So she really thrived in that kind of environment where there was like a lot of spontaneity. She could do what she wanted at any particular time. There was no one looking over her shoulder. On the other hand, there are rebels who are very attracted to areas of high regulation, like the military, the clergy, the police, and corporations with a lot of rules. This really puzzled me for a long time. But some rebels really like to be in an environment where there's a lot of rules to push against. They feel like that kind of gives them their energy and their focus. So you do see rebels in these environments often, which was very surprising to me to find out. Here's another interesting thing about rebels. If you have a team, whether it's a founding team, like the two of us started this company, or it's even like a romantic pair, if one person is a rebel, almost always the other person is an obliger. That's overwhelmingly the pattern. Because obligers team up the best with all three tendencies. They're like the type O, and they do best with rebels. Questioners and upholders often do not work well with rebels. So rebels will tend to gravitate toward obligers. And obligers kind of, they get something from the rebel tendency too. So it tends to be like a fruitful pairing.
Really? I was going to ask you about that. Like which one, like what pairs up the best together? What's your husband then? If you're an upholder?
He's a questioner, and I'm biased, of course, but that's a really good pairing, I think, because one of the limitations of the upholder tendency is that we tend to too easily go along with things. It's like, you're asking me to do something, I can do that, I will do that. Like, I'm not even questioning, like, should I do that? I just like execute. That's not good. We should stop and say, is this worth my time and energy? Like, why am I going to do this? People are asking me to do stuff all the time. Why would I do it? So I will often say to my husband, you think I should do this? And he'll say to me, why would you do that? And then I'm like, yeah, you're right. So even just being around him has helped me to kind of, my impulse is to just go ahead and do it. But he's taught me, wait, like a lot of times, if you don't do something, there are no consequences, so you don't have to do it. And then sometimes people ask you to do things that it's like, it's just not worth the time and the energy. And then I think for questioners, it's satisfying to be with upholders because questioners are so interdirected. They are totally interdirected. They respond well to the interdirection of upholders. And so I think my husband might be stressed out if he saw that I wasn't good at meeting my expectations for myself. Whereas it's like, we both exercise all the time. We both it doesn't bother him that I quit sugar because he's like, well, if that's what you're going to do for yourself, then fine.
Right.
He and so I think that's a very strong pairing. But as I say, obligers, they are the type O. They tend to pair up the most easily with all three. And they're the biggest tendency too. So you see obligers paired up with all three tendencies very commonly.
And it's not possible to change your tendency, correct? Like usually you are what you are, right? You can have a blend, but you can't really, like a questioner can't become an upholder or...
Typically not. What you do see is that people think that they've changed, but it's really circumstance. Like, oh, I used to be an obliger, but now I'm an upholder. But really, it's just you've created so much outer accountability for everything in your life. It feels like you're like, I'm in a book group, and I'm in a wine tasting group, and I'm in an exercise club, and you're like, okay, that's all outer accountability. Or you kind of misinterpret it. Like somebody said to me, well, I always thought I was a rebel in high school and college, but now I realize I was just doing what my friends expected me to do. So it looked like rebel from the outside, but it was really part of a peer pressure. So yeah, I think occasionally, and I've only seen this a handful of times, someone goes through a truly personality altering event, like a very serious brush with death, or a serious bout of addiction, or they're taking prescription medication that significantly alters the way their personality comes out. And those folks, and again, it's a small group of people, so I haven't really studied it. They seem to just sort of break free from the framework altogether. It's not like they switch from one tendency into another tendency. It's almost like their behavior just isn't matched into the tendencies at all in a way that I can perceive. And they just are kind of floating into another dimension. But as I say, that's very rare. I would say in my own life, I only know a handful of people where I would say, this person isn't the person that I once knew. And I feel like they're not the tendency that they once were.
I'm curious, so because you were in law, and I know you liked writing, where did all of this other stuff, all the psychological stuff, the human nature interest, the passion for that, was there something that happened before law school that you were just always curious about human nature, that this became your area, or what was?
It's funny that you say that because. No, I think I've always been interested in human nature. And, The Happiness Project was my fourth book. And so I wrote a book called Power, Money, Fame, Sex, The User's Guide. I wrote a biography of Winston Churchill, a biography of John F. Kennedy, and this weird book called Profane Waste, which is kind of about property. But really, they're all about human nature. And
wait, Happiness Project was your fifth book?
Yeah. So I was like the example of somebody who was an overnight sensation after 10 years of work. Yeah.
Wow.
But one of my favorite things about myself is I often become intensely fascinated by a subject, and I'll just do gigantic amounts of research. And I just went through this huge thing about being obsessed with color, but this is all the way back. I was obsessed with Harriet Tubman when I was little. So this is something that I often experience. But I think that once I started writing, that kind of universe of issues was what attracted me. But I remember, it's funny that you say that, though, because I remember I finally was like, oh, I understand the pattern. Looking back at all this stuff I've done, it's human nature. And I was like, that's my subject, human nature. I was very excited that I managed to put a word on it. And then I was talking to this person I know who's a very, very respected writer, nonfiction writer, big job and everything. And I said, yeah, my subject's human nature. She goes, that can't be your subject. That's too broad. And for 6 months, I was like, oh, I guess I can't have human nature as my subject. I mean, who can pick it? And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
It's not what are you saying? She probably was just jealous and envious that I had taken dibs on it.
Exactly.
Of course you can say that human nature is your subject. And of course I did say that human nature is my subject. It's preposterous to say, oh, you can't take that as your subject. But I believed it for 6 months. And that was an important lesson for me. Don't let somebody else tell you what your subject is. Of course, know yourself.
Absolutely. Know yourself. So you just kind of always are that personality that you just, when you start something, you kind of get so deep into it and you deep dive. And then one thing kind of led to another where this became the evolution of everything.
Yeah, that's exactly. It was just a natural outgrowth of something that I've been doing for a long time. Yeah.
So what are you going to do next? What's your next book?
My next book is going to be about the body and the senses and how to reach the mind through the body. So it's about the five kind of, what you would call kindergarten senses, but then also 4 additional senses, which I say are symbol, pattern, people, and time, which I just decided that I know about proprioception and all that stuff, but I'm not interested in that. It's about how to tap in, how to get to the mind, and to like experience more vividly kind of everyday life by trying to tap into the body. And it's just so much fun. It's like the most fun. Every project that I do, I'm like, there will never be a project as fun as this one. This is the most interesting subject that I will ever write. It's all downhill from here. And then I get to something else and I'm like, oh my gosh, I just want to read about vanilla all day. Like, let me tell you about ketchup. Crazy. So I love it.
Well, it's amazing because like you have so many bestsellers. Like it's not even normal. Like people usually get one and they're like thrilled, you know what I mean? But you kind of hit it over and over again. Well, after 10 years, I should say, right? Yeah. You're an overnight success after 10 years, right? But why do you think people were so captivated by the Happiness Project and it kind of like tapped into so many people? Do you think most people, because you earlier said you think most people are more or less happy? Do you really believe that? Because I would think the opposite for the reasons why your first book, your 5th book became so popular.
Well, the thing about my book is that I didn't start from a place of deep sadness or sorrow or despair or destruction. I was just an ordinary person, and I had a perfectly happy life. And one of the things that I thought, and I say this on the first page, is one of the things is I thought I didn't live up to it enough. I wasn't grateful enough. I didn't appreciate how happy I was, and then I didn't want something to happen and think like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how happy I was, until something happened. And so part of it was just trying to be more aware of my happiness, and it was also the idea that like there are easy things to do. Again, as I said, there's low-hanging fruit, things that don't take a lot of time, energy, or money that we can do to make our lives happier and richer. And it seems like such a shame not to do those things just because, it hasn't occurred to you. So I think what appealed to people about my book is it was very concrete. So I explained the reasons and the science, and I think that's kind of always fascinating to people. But it was also like, okay, a lot of times you'll read something and you'll be like, yeah, that's interesting, and I don't disagree, but I don't really understand like what that would mean for me or like how I would act on that in my own life. And so I think a lot of times what people found exciting about the book is they would get their own ideas. They would be like, oh, you're right, relationships are really important for all the reasons you say, and you're going to do this, but I'm going to do this. It kind of got them thinking about the things they could do. So a lot of it was they would do what I did because the stuff I did was pretty simple and straightforward, or they would think of their own things, which was even more exciting. So part of what's fun for me is like I'm in so much engagement with my listeners and readers. People are constantly giving me ideas and nuances and like, kind of tweaks. And it's great because I see all the things that people are doing and all the kind of imaginative things they've come up with. So I think that's what it tapped into was sort of this idea of, I want to be grateful for everything that I have, but I also kind of want to do more with it.
That's a great point, actually, because you were, it wasn't like you were in search for happiness because you were deeply depressed. It was about how to elevate what you already had. And because you kind of knew already. So then, and another thing I was going to just say was that, like you said, small little changes can make extravagant. You can have huge, extravagant change with little small tweaks all the time. Right. Yeah. So can you give people a little bit of like, give them some ideas of some small little tweaks that they can kind of do?
Well, one thing is the 1-minute rule. This is anything you can do in less than a minute, you do without delay. So you hang up your coat instead of throwing it over the chair, or you print out a document and put it in the folder instead of just like, leaving it sitting on the desk. And what this does is it gets rid of that kind of scum of clutter on the surface of everyday life. And for a lot of people, this is just transformative. Another thing that we do in our family, and this is a little bit different because usually the things that I suggest are things you don't need other people to cooperate with because often they don't want to cooperate. But one thing you can do is to really try to give warm greetings and farewells. And this is like, think about your dog. Your dog seems happy to see you. It's like when somebody comes or goes, really greet them. In our house, we really try to stand up and come to the person, give them a kiss, give them a hug, really acknowledge the fact that they've come back or they're leaving. And this just dramatically increases kind of the tender, attentive feeling in a household, because it's a very lonely feeling when you feel like nobody cares if I come or go. And even people who are very loving, it's like if they just grunt as they're like, looking at their phone when you walk in, it's like, it's not a great feeling, and it's easy to take it for granted. But it's a very easy habit to change. Another thing I would say is to think about having fun. A lot of adults are sort of like, well, there's fun for the whole family, but they don't really have fun for themselves. And we really do want to give ourselves healthy treats. When we give more to ourselves, we can ask more from ourselves, but you don't want to give yourself an unhealthy treat like a brownie or an impulse purchase or something, or a glass of wine, because you don't want to do something to make yourself feel better that in the end is just going to make you feel worse. But having a bunch of healthy treats, like maybe it's doing a crossword puzzle. That's my husband's healthy treat. Or maybe it's watching an episode of The Office. That's my daughter's healthy treat. I love perfume. So putting on perfume is a healthy treat for me. And it gives you that sense of being recharged, like you're like the cell phone that needs to get plugged into the wall. And when we give ourselves treats, we feel kind of energized and taken care of. But this is not a reward. It's not something that you deserve or that you have to earn. This is something that you get it just because you want it. I know this was something that was new to me. A lot of people shop and then they abandon their cart. They just like the thing of like picking out what they would take. Doesn't even matter how expensive it is because they're not going to buy it. They just have all the fun of putting it in the cart, and then they just click out. For some people, that's a healthy treat. Not for me, but I've heard from many people who just really love that, or like researching a trip. I'm not going to take that trip, but I'm going to research that trip. I'm like, okay, if it's fun for you, it's a healthy treat. And so those are some of the things I would say that you might think about to get started.
I wanted to, I know I've taken up a lot of your time.
I gotta go in like 2 minutes.
2 seconds. I want to leave with just one thing, because I think it's important for the time we're in right now with everything, the pandemic and everything going on. People are very lonely right now, right? How do people who are lonely, that's like a baseline of how they feel, practice happiness? What's a good way to kind of start on that process?
Well, the thing about loneliness is it's a very, very important signal that you need more social connection. And so it's not a question to surmount the feeling of loneliness, but to really create the emotional connections that are going to help alleviate the loneliness. But ironically, research shows that people who are lonely tend to have a harder time connecting with other people, and they tend to be like sort of more prickly and more judgmental. So if you're feeling lonely, you might really have to kind of force yourself to get out there. And of course, it's hard when you can't do the normal things that you would be doing and kind of in the casual way that you'd be connecting with people. But it's really important to take the time, even if you don't necessarily feel like it. Like maybe your book group's getting together and you're like, I don't feel like another Zoom call. But really force yourself to do it, because we do get an immediate mood boost by connecting with other people. It's hard when it's through these, it's not in real life or it's socially distanced or whatever. But we really, if you are feeling lonely, you really do want to try everything that you can. Maybe you go to a park and so you're just around other people. You're 6 feet apart, but you still have that sense of like just being part of a group, or you're just trying to do something that's going to allow you to engage with the world, because one of the keys to happiness is relationships with other people, and we really need to put that at the forefront of everything that we do.
Yeah, I think it's probably the most important, besides personality, knowing your personality, right?
Yes.
Well, you've been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's so fun to talk to you. Thank you so much.
It was really fun to talk to you. How do people find you if they want to know more, take your quiz and get your books, or all the above?
You can get everything. Everything is on my site, which is GretchenRubin.com. If you want to go straight to the quiz, which is free, it's quiz.GretchenRubin.com. If you want to listen to my podcast, it's called Happier with Gretchen Rubin, which is anywhere you listen to podcasts. I'm on social media all over the place under the name Gretchen Rubin. And I love to hear from people in all different ways with like insights and questions and observations. So, get in touch. If you want to find out more, just go to my website or contact me. Yeah.
I love your podcast too. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, it's so fun to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
It's so fun talking to you. Thank you so much for being a guest.
Thank you.
Habits and hustle, time to get it rolling. Stay up on the grind, don't stop, keep it going. Habits and hustle, from nothing into something. All out, hosted by Jennifer Cohen. Visionaries, tune in, you can get to know them. Be inspired, this is your moment. Excuses, we ain't having that. The Habits and Hustle podcast, powered by Habit Nest.